Have you ever looked at a teenager and thought, now there's someone ready to rule an empire? No? Me neither. And yet history has a strange sense of humor and tragedy, because once upon a time, in the echoing marble halls of ancient Rome, a boy was handed the imperial crown at the tender age of 13. He didn't win it. He didn't ask for it. But he got it anyway, along with all the enemies that came with it. Let me take you back to a time when the Roman Empire wasn't what it used to be. The old grandeur had faded into political backstabbing, noble scheming, and the occasional poison slipped into your wine. And right in the middle of this chaos, a child named Gordian III was thrust onto the throne. A boy emperor, somewhere between his last growth spurt and learning to shave, became the most powerful person in the Western world. Now let's pause there a moment. Imagine yourself at 13. What were you doing? Struggling through algebra, getting picked last in gym class? Gordian was busy being hailed as Augustus, cloaked in royal purple, cheered by senators, worshipped by soldiers, and watched very carefully by men who smiled a bit too much. His rise wasn't exactly noble or planned. It was desperate. The empire had just burned through 2 other emperors, literally. The first was Gordian's grandfather, who ruled for about a month before he and his son were both killed during a failed rebellion. The Senate, desperate for stability, looked around and saw a 12-year-old boy standing in the ashes of power. He was young, yes, but he was also harmless, untainted, and easy to control. Or so they thought. At first, things went surprisingly smoothly, perhaps too smoothly. The Senate surrounded Gordian with seasoned advisors, and the military accepted him, especially after the Senate threw piles of gold at the army to keep their swords sheathed. Gordian was a ceremonial emperor, a smiling face on coins and statues, while the real power pulsed behind the curtain. But even puppets can start to pull their own strings, and Gordian, young as he was, began to grow into his role. He wasn't foolish, this boy. He was observant, careful, and more popular than many expected. The people adored him because he wasn't corrupt, wasn't brutal, wasn't old enough to have enemies. Yet, he took his education seriously, reading philosophy, studying laws, and, according to surviving accounts, spoke with surprising dignity for someone who still probably had a squeaky voice. And then came the shadow. His protector, a man named Sithius, rose to become the real power behind the throne. A stern general and administrator, Sithius was loyal and skilled, and conveniently married his daughter to Gordian, making him not just a mentor, but a father-in-law. Suddenly the empire had a kind of makeshift royal family. The old men in the Senate relaxed, the soldiers saluted, and for a brief golden moment, Rome seemed to breathe again. But golden moments in history often come with strings attached, and this one was no exception. War loomed. The Eastern Front, always a thorn in Rome's sandal, was stirring. The Persians under King Shapur I were pressing against Roman borders with ambition and fire. Gordian, still barely a teen, was called upon to lead. Of course, Sithius did the real commanding, but Gordian went too, riding an armor that probably didn't quite fit, trying to look brave for the men cheering him on. It's hard to say what was in his heart then. Was he scared? Was he proud? Was he beginning to believe in the role he had been given, or wondering how long he could survive it? They marched eastward. Victories followed. The Roman army, under Sithius's careful direction, pushed the Persians back. Morale soared, and Gordian, though still young, began to be seen, not as a boy emperor, but a symbol of Rome's revival. It must have felt like a dream, finally earning the crown, not just wearing it, but as all students of Roman history know, when the empire smiles, someone is always sharpening a knife, and the knife, in this case, was already within the camp. The sea. March into the east had begun with optimism, but somewhere beyond the Euphrates, things started to change. Not on the battlefield, no, the Persians were still retreating, but within the Roman ranks themselves. Whispers began to swirl like desert winds, and in the center of the murmur was a name, Philip the Arab. Now, Philip wasn't an outsider. He was already a high-ranking officer, appointed as deputy under Time Scythius. He smiled often. He pledged loyalty. He toasted to Gordian's victories with polished enthusiasm. And then, just like that, Time Scythius fell ill. The imperial father-in-law, the guardian of the young emperor, the one man who might have kept Rome steady, died. Officially, it was disease. But Roman diseases often came in the form of daggers, wine goblets, or dinner guests who smiled too much. And guess who stepped into Time Scythius's shoes with remarkable speed? That's right, Philip. It was almost elegant, the way he did. No rebellion, no fuss, just quiet consolidation. He became commander. Then he began handling imperial finances, then military decisions. And finally, the young emperor, now just 14, found himself surrounded not by friends, but by men who answered to Philip. It's easy to forget how young Gordian was. 14, barely old enough to grow a beard, yet now expected to outmaneuver an ambitious general in the middle of a foreign war. The empire had become a chessboard, and Gordian was the king with no more pawns. The army, too, had begun to split. Some were loyal to the boy emperor. Others whispered of change, of strength, of a leader who could truly command. Philip was older, battle-hardened, charismatic in a calculating sort of way. He knew how to work a campfire and a council chamber with equal finesse. He knew that victory over the Persians would mean nothing if he wasn't the one celebrated for it. So he took control of the narrative. Some records say Gordian died in battle. Others claim he was murdered quietly, efficiently, by soldiers loyal to Philip. A few, perhaps the more romantic historians, insist he was buried near the battlefield. With honor, his grave unmarked but mourned. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The boy was gone. Philip returned to Rome not as a general but as emperor. He told the Senate that Gordian had died tragically, and they, spineless as ever, nodded and wrote it down as fact. After all, dead emperors make poor arguments, especially teenage ones, and so Rome moved on, as it always did. But here's the thing. Gordian III is easy to overlook in textbooks. A footnote, a child king lost in the mess of the 3rd century crisis. But if you pause and really look at his story, it's quietly astonishing. In just 1 year on the throne, he'd held off civil war, rebuilt trust in the Senate, helped lead a victorious campaign, and stood as a symbol of hope in an empire that had nearly eaten itself alive. And he did all that before his 15th birthday. What were you doing at 14? What was I doing? Certainly not keeping Rome from collapsing in on itself. It makes you think, how many great stories are buried under the dust of those who came after? How many children, if given time, could have become giants? Gordian wasn't given time, but for a brief moment he was more than a boy. He was the axis on which Rome spun, a silent thread that held it together just long enough for history to keep going. There's something bittersweet about that, isn't there? The way some lives flare up briefly and beautifully and then vanish, leaving only questions behind. Was Philip truly behind it? Did the soldiers regret what they'd done? Did Gordian sense it coming? No one knows. But every time you see a Roman coin with a soft-cheeked boy's face on it, staring out with wide, curious eyes, that's him. That's Gordian. And that's the face of an emperor who ruled not with fear or fire, but with the kind of fragile hope only a child can carry. And sometimes that's what makes him unforgettable. You know, when we talk about emperors, we usually expect a trail of scandals, wars, and cruelty. Nero fiddling while Rome burns, Caligula declaring war on the sea. But Gordian's short reign offers something almost unheard of in Roman history: dignity without disaster. A boy who wore the purple robe, not as a tyrant in training, but as a symbol of peace and decency. That's perhaps the most haunting part. He wasn't corrupted yet. He hadn't had the chance to become cruel. His hands weren't stained with executions. He hadn't bankrupted the treasury with orgies and golden statues. There's no dramatic downfall in his story, just a quiet vanishing. A candle blown out in a gust of ambition. And yet the empire did what it always did. It repainted history. Under Philip's orders, statues of Gordian were quietly removed. Records became vague. Coins were melted. Names were struck from monuments, sometimes replaced by the new emperors. It's what Romans called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Erase the name, erase the threat. But history has a sense of irony, because despite Philip's efforts, the people remembered the boy. Quietly, stubbornly, soldiers whispered about him in taverns, senators told stories about his gentleness, his sense of duty, his eerie calm for someone so young. Coins bearing his image became keepsakes, tiny acts of defiance tucked into tunics and passed down like family myths. And when Philip's own reign began to spiral, because of course it did, there were murmurs. That Gordian had been the better choice. That Rome had lost more than a child, it had lost its last chance for peace. You see, Philip's rule wasn't the golden age he promised. The Persians rose again. The economy crumbled. And rebellions began to bubble across the empire like boiling water in a cracked pot. He had seized power, yes, but what he found was a seat that burned everyone who sat on it. The imperial throne in the 3rd century was cursed ground. Between assassinations, economic collapse, barbarian invasions, and betrayal at every feast, it became less of a crown and more of a countdown. And Gordian had walked into it wide-eyed, too young to know he was supposed to be afraid. But that's exactly what made him different. Most emperors ruled through fear, fear of enemies, fear of the Senate, fear of their own guards. Gordian ruled for that brief year with something else. Maybe it was innocence, maybe it was the natural calm of someone who hadn't learned how to be ruthless. Maybe it was just clarity. He didn't want to be remembered as a god. He just wanted to do right by Rome, and that's rare, too rare. In fact, some scholars believe Gordian's reign marked the last moment the Roman Empire felt safe. Not secure, there were always wars, but emotionally safe. The people believed again, however briefly, that a ruler could be good, that the future might hold something better, that their emperor wasn't a monster in disguise. You know, as we get older, it's easy to become cynical about leaders, past or present. We've seen enough of them fall, fail, or lie. But Gordian, he reminds us that sometimes, even in the most brutal places, even in a time soaked in ambition and blood, there can still be someone who just tries, and that's worth remembering. So next time you hear someone say that all emperors were corrupt, all power poisons, or all history is just a list of tyrants, pause. Think of the boy who never wanted to rule, but did, who never asked to, fight but marched, who never had time to fail or to shine, and yet somehow managed to do both quietly in the space of a single impossible year. That's the story they tried to erase, and somehow it still lingers. In books, in dusty coins, in quiet conversations, in hearts that still hope for leaders who care more than they conquer. Now, if you've followed Roman history for any length of time, you know it's full of big names: Caesar, Augustus, Constantine. Men who carved their legacies into marble and myth. But Gordian III, he wasn't loud. He didn't rewrite laws or conquer half the known world. He wasn't a firework. He was a flicker, a small, steady light in a storm of chaos, and perhaps that's why he's so easy to miss and so important to remember. Because sometimes the quiet ones, those who don't scream for attention or demand worship, are the ones who show us the most, not through drama but through restraint, through gentleness, through showing up, doing their best, and not losing themselves in the process. But it wasn't just Gordian's demeanor that made his story tragic. It was also the world he was born into, a crumbling Rome. By the time he took the throne, the empire was like a once mighty mansion with cracks in every wall. Beautiful from a distance, but slowly sinking from within. And here's this child, barely out of school, being handed the keys and told, "Fix it." He tried. But what chance does a boy have against rot that runs deep, against egos sharper than swords, against generals who see kindness as weakness and mercy as a flaw. It's a question we still ask today. How do you lead in a world that doesn't want to be saved? How do you keep your hands clean when every path forward drips with compromise? The truth is, Gordian was born too late for peace and too early for help. He was a good emperor at the worst possible time, a rare flower blooming in winter, doomed not because of who he was, but because of when he was. And yet, he still mattered. He mattered to the soldiers who followed him willingly, not out of fear, but out of affection. He mattered to the Senate, who saw in him a flicker of the old republic's dignity. And he mattered to the people, especially the ordinary ones, who hoped for once their emperor might be someone they didn't have to fear. After his death, there were no grand monuments, no triumphant marble arches. Philip made sure of that. But still, traces of Gordian appeared, in little ways, in quiet ways. A merchant's ring carved with his initials, a mosaic tucked away in a forgotten villa. A name whispered, not as a warning but as a memory. And over time the legend began to shift. Historians, monks, and even storytellers began to ask, what if? What if he had lived? Would Rome have found peace? Would the cycle of betrayal and bloodshed have slowed? Of course, we'll never know. But that question, that haunting what if, gives his story power. Because unlike the emperors who followed, whose endings we can predict before we finish reading the paragraph, Gordian's tale is full of maybes, full of possibility, full of potential unrealized. And in that, he becomes more than just a name on a scroll. He becomes something else, a reminder that the world doesn't always reward goodness, that history often skips over those who tread lightly. That being kind in the wrong time can be dangerous, but it also reminds us deeply, quietly, that goodness matters anyway, that even if it only lasts a moment, it leaves a mark. And sometimes, that's enough. Maybe that's why we keep telling his story. Not because of what he conquered, but because of what he never got the chance to. So here we are, at the end of a story that was never really supposed to begin, and yet somehow still echoes through time. A boy who never got to grow old, a ruler who never really got to rule, and yet, oddly enough, a name that still stirs something, tender in the hearts of those who find him tucked between the pages of dusty history books. In a world obsessed with winners, Gordian's story lingers precisely because he didn't win, not in the traditional sense. He didn't outlive his rivals. He didn't leave behind marble columns or a legacy of conquest. There's no ancient festival in his honor. But there is something else, something rarer. There's the sense that, for once someone tried to wear power gently. There's a purity to his tragedy. No scandal, no excess, no cruelty. He came to the throne too young, yes, but he never used that as an excuse to be reckless. He asked questions. He listened, he tried. And that in the poisoned bloodstream of late Rome was revolutionary. And you know, maybe that's the real legacy. Not the coins, not the campaigns, but the way his story still invites us to reflect. To ask, what does it really mean to lead well? What does it mean to have influence but not lose your soul? And more personally, what do we leave behind, not in monuments, but in the way we make people feel? Because whether you're an emperor or just someone trying to get through your day, that's what we're remembered for. Not the job title, not the bank balance, but the echo of our presence, the feeling we leave behind. Gordian's name doesn't top the charts of Roman greatness, but in the cracks of imperial history, in the shadows between chaos and collapse, you'll find a young man who reminds us of something powerful. That goodness, however brief, leaves a deeper mark than any crown. So if you've ever felt like your best efforts went unnoticed, or like the world rewards the loudest voice in the room, not the kindest, take heart. Gordian's life is proof that quiet strength matters, that trying your best, even in the face of impossible odds, is noble in itself, and that sometimes being a decent human being in a broken world is the most radical thing of all. He ruled for just 1 year. But what a year it was, And now it's up to us to remember him, not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it moved you, or made you think, or simply gave you a moment of calm in a noisy world, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories of forgotten figures, quiet revolutions, and the beauty in unexpected places, please like the video and subscribe. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about how we choose to carry it forward. And sometimes, carrying forward the memory of a forgotten boy emperor is a small but powerful act of kindness.